Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. First of all, my apologies for this video coming out late. It's probably about an hour or so late. I was on a business trip and I missed my train, and so this is being recorded later than I would usually like. My apologies for the inconvenience. Let's begin how we normally do with the economy. Over the weekend at a wealth management forum in Beijing, economist and former vice chairman of China's central bank, Zhou warned the audience that Beijing cannot continue to avoid reforming the nation's pension system, which he argues is, quote, full of flaws, end quote. Zhou said that the pressure is growing to dangerous levels. Quote, a reality in China is that it has a large population, and simultaneously the scope of pensions continues to expand. Generally speaking, due to the aging population, there will easily be a crack in the pension pool, end quote. Of course, every man and his dog knows that China is facing a serious demographic decline. 28% of China's population is expected to be aged 60 or above by 2040. We also recently covered the news that last year, birth rates dropped to their lowest level since records began back in 1994, with the national population officially declining for the first time since the Mao-era famines. Zhou said that most countries have a pension pool amounting to 50 to 100% of their GDP. In China, it's less than 10% of GDP. He admits that this is not good and that urgent reform needs to be made to the pension system now in order to soften the future blow. He also makes it clear that households will need to look out for themselves to some extent. Quote, state pensions will guarantee the basics and will not be too high. In other words, a relatively large gap will be largely supplemented by private pensions. We are still not doing enough to assess the conditions for future retirees and communicate with the public, end quote. Of course, households having to save even more to ensure they are okay in retirement due to insufficient pensions is not going to help with policymaker efforts to increase consumption to support economic growth. Next up for the economy. In January, Hong Kong saw its exports plunge by the most in 70 years as the special administrative region continues to struggle with the political and economic fallout from the last few years and slowing global demand. According to the numbers published by the local Census and Statistics Department yesterday, exports declined almost 37% year-on-year in January to $37.1 billion, the largest drop the city has seen since the Korean War. For their part, imports dropped to 30%. Of course, the primary cause for the drop is slowing global demand, but local economic and political instability are not helping either, though we should also take into account an earlier Chinese New Year period this year. Quote, the export weakness was much as expected given the slowing global economy background this year, although the combined data for January and February will give a clear picture as the January data is distorted by the early Lunar New Year, end quote. There are mixed views and limited optimism for the year ahead too. Quote, Hong Kong's recovery will mainly be driven by tourism comeback after China border reopening, which should counter the headwinds from weaker exports and high local interest rates, end quote. With the publication of the data, a government spokesperson expressed, quote, the slower global economic growth will continue to pose severe challenges to Hong Kong's export performance in the near term, end quote. Next up, an explosion in coal power and the Ukraine war. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button. Also, if you believe you should be subscribed to China Update, it may be worth checking this now, as again recently YouTube has been unsubscribing people. And as always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. As anticipated, China has massively accelerated construction of coal-powered power stations. According to a report published this week by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and Global Energy Monitor, last year local governments okayed over 106 gigawatts of new plants, quadrupling the rate from the year before. This new coal capacity is equivalent to all the UK's plants combined. The report observed too, quote, construction has already begun on 50 gigawatt, 6 times more than the rest of the world combined, end quote, adding, quote, China continues to be the glaring exception to the ongoing global decline in coal plant development, end quote. We should not be surprised by these developments, however. We remember that China has experienced rather disruptive and at times painful energy shortages in both summer and winter these last 2 years. Last year, the southwest of the country was especially affected when a historic drought decimated the region's hydropower capacity. After each of these periods of power stress, Beijing leadership made calls for more power capacity, which would mostly be made up of coal. Now, China leads the world in clean energy investments too, but as this report shows, in the Middle Kingdom, over the medium term at the very least, coal is very much here to stay. And last up for today's episode, last week we covered moves in the China-Russia relationship as it relates to the US and NATO and the war in Ukraine. Let's supplement this coverage now by updating ourselves with the latest developments on this particular front. Over the weekend, Beijing published its so-called position on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. This appears to be the peace plan that officials in the PRC Foreign Ministry have been alluding to over the last few weeks. The document itself has been described as disappointing and underwhelming by more than one analyst, as it appears to be just a packaging of the Russia-leaning statements Beijing has maintained since the war broke out. There doesn't appear to be an articulated and detailed roadmap for peace, which Beijing is committing itself to. Some didn't think the plan was underwhelming, however. Hungary's Prime Minister expressed, quote, "We consider China's peace plan important and support it," end quote. After Beijing published this plan, Ukraine President Zelensky also expressed that he hopes that China can help end the war and that he hopes to meet with General Secretary Xi Jinping. We should note, however, that despite Beijing's official claims that it has continued to call for dialogue in order to end the conflict, Xi Jinping has not spoken to Zelensky since before the war started, while Xi has had several conversations and meetings with Putin. Beijing authorities have so far not publicly responded to Zelensky's call for a summit with Xi. Meanwhile, over the weekend, the US once again warned Beijing against sending lethal assistance to Russia. As we covered last week, there are conflicting reports regarding whether China has already or is planning to send military aid. For example, US-based Washington Post writes in the most recent article, citing US officials, that China is considering sending Russia lethal military aid in the form of artillery shells. But the outlet admits, quote, "There is no evidence that any weapons transfers have occurred," end quote. As of filming, nothing else has been confirmed either. Whether lethal support is provided to Russia or not is a space that we need to watch closely. Multiple senior US officials have warned that this would be a red line in the US-China relationship, signaling that economic sanctions and maybe more are on the table. In an interview yesterday, United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that any military aid for Russia, quote, would be a big mistake, end quote. Interestingly, a Morning Consult survey found that Chinese adults broadly favor neutrality, with only 7% supporting sending weapons to Russia and only 5% supporting the sending of troops. The same survey also found that many Chinese remain uncertain about whether their country has benefited from the war in Ukraine. Indeed, a new report from the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences Institute of International Relations, published in Xiamen University's Pacific Journal, has concluded that China's neighbors have accelerated military expansion and preparations since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, out of fear that what has happened in Europe could also happen in East Asia. The report argues, quote, "The crisis in Ukraine has further exacerbated tensions in China's surroundings, creating a new round of security dilemmas and causing Japan, South Korea, and India to lean further towards the United States." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Once again, my apologies for it coming out a little later than usual. I will try to avoid that in the future. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you all, hopefully at the regular time, tomorrow.